Salutations, this is Dr. Fables. Today I will discuss Ikomikidomoe, the name of the so-called Zanpakuto in the Can't Fear Your Own World light novels. This video is for entertainment purposes only. Some spoilers are inevitable, but I shall endeavour to keep this to a minimum. Please bear in mind that I use British English, so some words may sound odd or incorrect to viewers in the Americas. Kindly note that the British aren't the only ones to use British English. People in Europe, people in the Commonwealth countries, people in former British colonies also use British English, sometimes with their own localizations, quirks, and unique pronunciations. Should you be curious about the different pronunciations, phrasings, spellings, stresses, etc. between American English and British English, please conduct your own research, utilize Google search and online dictionaries. I crave your tolerance and understanding when you hear words that sound alien, funny, and incorrect to you. I hope that you exercise the same tolerance and understanding in your real life as well. Now, Ikomikidomoe, the name, is written in kanji. Kanji itself is based on Chinese characters. In the very old days, Chinese script was the diplomatic language of East Asia. And by the old days, I mean it goes as far back as BC times. So, Chinese script comes in traditional script and simplified script. See this example here with the traditional and simplified Chinese script for the word dragon. The simplified kanji version is also provided. Notice that the simplified scripts for both the Chinese and kanji variants have fewer strokes and don't look much like their traditional script great-grandma, majestic though she is. The simplified version is taught in some parts of the world, the traditional script taught in other countries, and some countries even teach both versions. Of course, this does make things slightly complicated, and we're still talking about Chinese script here. I haven't gone into kanji yet. So either way, regardless as to the version one is taught, it is generally expected that one has some reading knowledge of the other version as well. For example, if one is taught the simplified Chinese version in schools as a compulsory second or third language, one is expected to have some knowledge of the traditional variant, as some books, some newspapers, etc. still publish in the traditional variant. Japanese has something similar when it comes to kanji, as there is kyujitai or old kanji based on traditional Chinese script, and there is modern kanji or shinjitai. Kyujitai simply means old written character forms. Shinjitai means new written character forms. Character in this context refers to the form that the word takes, how you write it. For ease of reference, though it's not strictly accurate, I will call kyujitai traditional or old kanji, and shinjitai will be called modern or simplified kanji. As you can see from the example with the character for dragon, simplified kanji can sometimes differ wildly from the Chinese simplified version, as you have seen here. There are also some kanji that look exactly like their traditional or simplified counterparts in Chinese script, but have different meanings completely. But I digress. Now, let's look at the modern Chinese character for dragon. The simplified script has fewer strokes than the traditional script. Both kanji and Chinese script can be tricky because each character and each word can be read in many ways. Each of these ways of reading a given word can convey a different definition. This is what happens in Mandarin. Mandarin being the language you most commonly hear in Taiwan, China, for example, and some parts of Southeast Asia, where it is taught as a second or third language. Now, let's say a certain Chinese word in Mandarin can be read in 3 different ways, depending on context and sentence structure. Each of these 3 different ways of reading will have different meanings. Thus, if it is read as X, it will have meaning A. If read as Y, it will have meaning B. If read as Z, it will have meaning C. If paired with another word before it to make a 2-word phrase, it will take on reading X, but have meaning D. If paired with another word after it, it is still read as X, but the 2-word phrase now conveys meaning E. If paired with 3 other words to make a 4-word idiom, it is read as Y, and the 4-word idiom conveys meaning F. If paired up into a 6 or 8-word idiom, it is read as Z, and the long 6 to 8-word idiom conveys meaning G. And that's just in Mandarin. It gets more complicated when you factor in that the Chinese language is not a uniform language spoken by all Chinese people. And the Chinese people are not a homogeneous group. There are the Han Chinese, which are the majority, and the ethnic minorities who look Chinese but aren't. These are like the Hui people, the Mongolians, the Manchurians, the Tujia, etc., etc. They each have their own language, and they use Chinese script as well that have the same pronunciation as their own native words to teach their language at a very basic level. Then there are regional dialects that are distinct and separate from the different Han dialect groups' languages. These languages also use Chinese script, but they sound and mean completely different from the pronunciations and definitions used in Mandarin and Han dialects. Let me give you a further example. Mandarin, Cantonese, and Hokklo news on telly, radio, and the newspapers in the Far East, for example, use the sounds of Mandarin, Cantonese, and Hokklo words, which are all written in Chinese script, to transliterate Western names of people, living and historical, as well as places that are Western places, that is, into their respective languages. When used thus, the meaning of these words are not taken into consideration. You're just taking the sound. So they are used because of the approximation to the sound of a certain Western name. Japanese does something similar by using the sounds they have to transliterate Western and non-Japanese names, sometimes places, into Japanese, though they do it with katakana rather than kanji. I shan't cover the ethnic minorities' languages, but know that they exist, and they and their peoples are not to be confused with the Han Chinese, even though they look Chinese. Now, within the Han Chinese, which is the majority subgroup within the so-called Chinese peoples, there are many dialect groups. These dialect groups all use Chinese script, but here is where it gets slightly hairy. Remember I said earlier in my example that a Chinese word can be read in 3 possible ways? Well, each dialect group has their own ways of reading each Chinese word that is different from the Mandarin. This can vary between 2 to 3 different readings per word. The meanings of these words, when read in their dialect ways and when paired with other words read in their respective dialects, may also differ significantly from their Mandarin counterparts. This demonstrates that just because something is in Chinese script, it is not necessarily Mandarin, and it doesn't necessarily carry the same definition as the meaning in Mandarin. For example, there are certain phrases that are written with the same characters for Mandarin and all Han Chinese dialects. But not only is this word read differently in each dialect and Mandarin, such a phrase would have meaning X in Mandarin, but meaning Y in dialect A, and meaning Z in yet another dialect, for example. Kanji has something similar because it is based on Chinese characters. Each word can be read differently. Each reading can convey a different meaning. The reading and meaning of the given word will change if paired up with other words to form phrases or idioms. Like Chinese script, kanji has old and modern versions. Take sakura, the word for cherry blossoms. Notice that the modern version has fewer strokes and looks simpler. Like Chinese script, where both traditional and simplified scripts are acceptable as long as used consistently, both the modern and old versions of sakura are acceptable in writing as long as you use only one. And that is, if you use traditional, go traditional all the way. If you use modern, go modern all the way. That's the way it is. Some countries have a definite preference as to whether traditional script or simplified script is used, but we will not go into that as politics can be another thorny issue. When to use the old version and when to use the new version, you may ask? That may be put down to a number of reasons. You may prefer to use the traditional or old character because you feel it looks beautiful or it describes your name and your character better. I know someone in a country that teaches the simplified script as a second language, but they choose to write their surname in the traditional way. Sometimes parents just like the way modern and traditional characters look. and they go with that for their child. Sometimes parents can be rather superstitious, so they choose the traditional script rather than a simplified one because they have their reasons. In traditional non-Christian East Asian families, traditional horoscopes are a thing, not across the board, mind you, but only by some pockets in certain communities in East Asia. Please bear that in mind. When I say horoscope here, I mean the East Asian horoscope. For example, Miss X is born in the year of the goat, at the hour of the horse, and the minute of the cockerel. Yes, cockerel is a legitimate and alternative way to say rooster. Look it up in a dictionary if you don't believe me. It has nothing to do with a certain part of the human anatomy at all. Now, in the context of horoscopes and names, I'm giving you the oversimplified version. If your birth date and birth hour occur when the planets and stars are in a certain position, then it may mean bad luck will befall you throughout your life. To counter that, your elders, your parents, your grandparents may write your name with a certain number of strokes so that the total number of strokes in your full name, surname and given name, meets the number that will cancel out your lifelong misfortune. They will have to consult a soothsayer or similar personage to figure out what characters to write, what characters to use, how many strokes in total is the optimum number, etc. So in this case, they might use the traditional or old script in both Chinese and kanji. Alternatively, if your birth horoscope and planets and hour clash with someone else's in your family, such as your father, for example, this means either one of you will die young. To counter that, your elders will have to write your name with a certain number of strokes that is much fewer than your father's name to cancel out this ill omen indicated by you and your dad's traditional horoscopes clashing. In this case, the simplified script or modern kanji is used. These are just made-up examples, but you get the rough idea. And I repeat again, this is not across the board. Only some pockets in some communities in East Asia are this superstitious. And they have to negate it by having names with a certain number of strokes. Right, now let's move on. The thing about Chinese characters and kanji is that one wrong stroke can change the word utterly. That is, you will end up with a completely different word. If you omit a stroke, it becomes another word with a whole different set of readings and meanings. If you add a horizontal stroke, it becomes yet another completely different word with its own sets of readings and meanings. If you add a vertical stroke rather than a horizontal one, it becomes yet another word that can be read differently in a number of ways and convey a whole bunch of other different meanings. What has this got to do with Ikomikidomoe in the Can't Fear Your Own World like novels? In the series, the villain, Tokinada Tsuneyashiro, steals it from the Ryokyu, the Soul King Palace. He gives it to a kid named Hikone to wield because he can't use it himself. Ikomikidomoe is not a mere zanpakuto. This is a spoiler, so go no further if you don't want to know more. I repeat, don't go further if you don't want spoilers. Are you still here? If you have stayed, then you should know that Ikomikidomoe is an ancient Ahujas class hollow sealed inside a sword by Oetsu Nimaya of the Zero Squad. Ikomikidomoe is not the name of this Ahujas class hollow. It is the name given to the zanpakuto form that it is sealed in. You perceive the distinction? Good. For simplicity's sake, I will continue calling this hollow zanpakuto Ikomikidomoe. I will not go into Ikomikidomoe's entire history. All you need to know is that Ikomikidomoe devoured a lot of souls. At some point in Soul Society's distant history, it thrashed and defeated a young Genryosai Yamamoto and sought to devour the Soul King. Ichibe Hyosobe, head of Zero Squad and the fellow who looks like a jolly monk, defeated it, and he used his zanpakuto Ichimonji, which is a huge calligraphy brush in its sealed state, to erase Ikomikidomoe's real name. We know from the Bleach manga that Ichimonji, that is Ichibe zanpakuto, has the ability to spew ink in its shikai form, and anything this ink covers and blots over will lose its name. Thus, this was the way in which Ichibe erased Ikomikidomoe's real name. Because Ikomikidomoe was a most disagreeable piece of work whilst hollow, eating all manner of souls and becoming ridiculously powerful, it contained far too many souls to purify. And I presume, given what we know of hell from the glimpses we saw in the August 2021 special chapter of Bleach, sending it to hell would upset the balance of souls in the greater schema of things vis-a-vis Soul Society, the Living World, and Huecomondo. Zero Squad dealt with it by getting Oetsu to seal it in a Zanpakuto. Cast your mind back a little, and you will recall that I said Ichibe erased its name earlier. Now that Oetsu had sealed it in a Zanpakuto, Ichibe wanted to make sure it wouldn't recall its own name and summon its full power ever again. Ichibe therefore used his Bankai, Shirafude Ichimonji, to rename this hollow in a Zanpakuto. He did so by renaming it Ikomikidomoe. Oetsu then took it and hid it in the Hohoden in the Soul King Palace until Tokinada showed up and the sword got stolen. At this point, you should also bear in mind that all kanji is based on Chinese characters, which is in turn based on ancient pictogram glyphs. I will use the terms pictogram and glyph interchangeably. Pictograms are what the character is in picture form. Think of it like this. Back in the primordial days of ancient history, so far back that hunter-gatherers was still the norm, someone looks at a tree or an animal and wants to know how to give it a name. This name must be easy to recall, so they drew the animal and used this drawing to form the written character that would eventually evolve into the word. Let me give you a concrete example. Here you see tortoise or turtle in Chinese script, kanji, and the pictogram glyph the modern Chinese character and kanji are based on. Look at the square part where it looks like it's divided into further squares. That's the tortoise shell. The top is the tortoise head with its snappy mouth, and the bottom part curling to the right is its tail. Both the ancient Chinese Han Dynasty pictogram glyph version of the kanji and Chinese character for tortoise looks even more like one. Do you see? Look at the pictogram version. See the legs on the left? Do you see the head with the snappy mouth at the top, the shell on the right, the tail at the bottom sweeping right? That's an example of a pictogram and how it evolved into Chinese script and kanji as we know it. If you go all the way back into the history of any given word in Chinese script or kanji, you will have a clearer idea of said character or word's etymology. When you do so, you will also notice this pictogram trend. It looks like whatever the character is describing. In this example, I used tortoise to illustrate my point. Ikomikidomoe is written thus in kanji. I have supplied you with the pronunciation of each word as well. That's the name used in the original Japanese text of the Can't Feel Your Own World light novels. Notice that the characters look superficially the same, but they are most assuredly not. They are completely unrelated and completely different. The second and the fourth character are the same though, but the rest are different. Very, very different. At first glance, you might say the first character looks like the second and fourth ones, but careful observation shows that the second and fourth characters are missing a horizontal stroke. You might say characters 1 and 3 look the same, but they are not. Character 1 has a gap in the top left-hand corner, but the top left-hand corner is fully joined in character 3. That the characters look similar is no coincidence. It's deliberately done. Ichibe did so as a calligrapher of Chinese or kanji script because he knows adding one stroke or omitting one stroke changes the possible meanings and readings. See how complicated it gets? And how it ties into what I said earlier? So, how would you know which reading to use and which meaning it is meant to convey? The kanji all look so similar, so it's easy to mix the order up. It's all intentionally done to confuse Ikomikidomoe and keep him from recalling his own name. To us moderns, giving a name to something makes it knowable and a little less frightening because you know what it is and can perhaps find some way of dealing with it. If Jane is in severe pain during menses, for instance, it greatly helps finding a doctor who is willing to listen and diagnose her. When she finds out that she has endometriosis, she can get some treatment and find some form of relief. Because Jane knows what she's suffering from, after learning its name, she can better cope with this condition and seek out treatment for it. I assume the same holds for Ikomikidomoe. If he knows, or it knows rather, its true name, it can unleash its full power and it can cause untold damage. Erasing its name and using kanji that look similar but not quite and has slight variations between them, Ikomikidomoe is more likely to be confused by the name he's been given and the similar looking characters. Let's break it down. Let's start by looking at the first character. It can be read in kanji as yi, I, sude, ya, nomi, mi. Remember what I said about pictograms being the roots of kanji and Chinese characters if you go far back enough in its history? Well, in this case, character 1 in Ikomikidomoe's name is read as I, and its original pictogram is meant to be a very wee fetus, all curled up before limbs were formed. Only the head is somewhat formed, emphasis on somewhat. I will come back to this point a bit. It's powerless, helpless, unable to survive on its own, outside the womb. Now apply this definition to Ikomikidomoe. It has been sealed in a sword, its figurative womb. It's useless and powerless unless wielded by someone who can control it and nourish it, so to speak. It cannot manifest its power willy-nilly unless its wielder gives the command. When Ichibei erased its name, it kind of reverted in some way to a metaphorical fetus that can survive only in a sword, this metaphorical womb. So now it's prevented from running around freely doing whatever it pleases. The Chinese character used here means to stop, or to finish something, or to be already done with a task. The kanji has the meaning to cease, to stop, to be over, or something that can't be helped and must be coped with, or the condition of something already being done, or it's already too late. So, what does this character tell us about the name Ichibei gave it? Its first character means to be over or to stop, and it has been stopped because it was defeated by Ichibei, getting its name erased and sealed in a sword by Oetsu. In a sense, its path of rampage when it was trying to kill and eat the Soul King is over, and it's too late for it to continue what it's doing. It's been regressed into its fetus form, but the fact that the character used isn't fully joined up, as seen in a gap in the top left, raises some questions. Does it indicate that Ikomikidomoe's powers are reduced to a fetus level and deliberately left thus unfinished so that it can't tap into its full might? Or does that gap in the top left of the character mean that Ikomikidomoe's power has been reduced to a fetus-like level, but there is room for it to grow and develop, and that will happen eventually and gradually? As we can see in the Can't Feel Your Own World novels, both these possibilities held some water in the course of the events that unfolded and vacillate between these two possibilities. Characters 2 and 4 are the same as I've mentioned before. It is definitely not the same as the first character. The kanji in characters 2 and 4 can be read as ko, ki, onore, ono, ora, ore, suchinoto, oto, na, mi. Notice that character 2 is read as ko and character 4 is read as ki. The Chinese character means A, the self, B, something that is personal or private to one, C, a surname, D, the sixth of the 10 heavenly stems that was a Chinese symbol of ordinals used in the Shang dynasty dating back to about 1250 BC. This was used for the 10 days of the week. Yes, back then the Shang dynasty had 10 days of the week, let's not question it. And they used these ordinals to mark the 10 days of the week and to specifically identify ritual dates and sacrifices for dead family members. Could this be a hint of Ichibei's regret at his inability to give peace and final rest to the souls consumed by Ikomikidomoe prior to its defeat? Could this be a way for him to remember the dead and souls consumed by Ikomikidomoe? We don't have enough information on that to make a definitive conclusion. Its pictogram glyph, etymology-wise, is a silk rope for binding objects. Observe the reverse S shape it forms like a rope. You see it? The kanji meanings are more or less the same as the Chinese meanings, sans the surname bit. So what does it mean in the name Ikomikidomoe? It is in effect bound up in the sword and can't get out unless released by the wielder. You just imagine that if the sword is wrapped up by a silken rope. Yes, so that's the analogy is supposed to come to mind. In ancient Chinese courts of several dynasties, in BC times and early AD times, if you were a lady of some importance or whatever, you could be ordered to die, and you would be given a very long white horizontal piece of silk, which you are supposed to throw over a beam and make something with which you can put your head through, if you catch my drift. In another sense, Ikomikidomoe has been given a death sentence from a certain point of view, because it is bound to the sword, and with its name erased, it doesn't know it. Its name, anymore. So even though it remembers its past, it cannot truly regain its sense of self when its name has been erased. It cannot recall its name, and it has been given a new one with characters that look similar to one another. The third character can be read in kanji as ji, shi, mi. 3 different ways. In the name Ikomikidomoe, it is read as mi. The pictogram glyph from the Chinese character is a squiggle that looks like an ear. There are 2 theories on what it represents. Han Dynasty texts dating back to 121 AD postulate that it could be a snake or a writhing reptile. In the Western Zhou, approximately 1045 BC to 771 BC, it was possibly used to indicate a fetus or the placenta. Scholars are divided on this. Even so, we can make deductions as to the meaning intended. The kanji definition supports the scholars who posit the notion of the pictogram glyph depicting a snake or writhing reptile. As in Japanese, it can refer to the snake, as in the 6th sign of the Chinese zodiac. The hour of the snake, around 10 a.m., 9 to 11 a.m., 10 a.m., 12 noon. Scholars are split on that as well. For the fetus analogy, we can go back to the explanation for character 1 that tells us Ikomikidomoe has been rendered a fetus of sorts that is sealed in a sword womb, unable to get out unless called out, a metaphor, or metaphorically pulled out by its wielder. If a snake or writhing reptile is the meaning intended, and this is the one I gravitate towards, then the image in Can't Fear Your Own World that Kubo drew of it in its hollow form, where it looks like a giant salamander, fits the bill. It appears Ichibei might have thought of Ikomikidomoe the Hollow as a slimy snake or reptile, and hence the inclusion of this character in the name he gave it. Since I covered the 4th character when I spoke about the 2nd, let's move on to the 5th. Look at the 5th character in its name. In Mandarin and the many Han Chinese dialects and regional non-ethnic based dialects, it has multiple possible different meanings, especially when paired up with other words. In Japanese, it can be read as he, ha, tomoe with a T. In the name given by Ichibei, it has been rendered as domoe with a D, in the same way that hana, meaning flower, has been rendered into ikebana with a B, meaning the art of flower arrangement when put together. It's one of those little grammar rule things. In Japanese, this 5th character can mean A, a swirling design that is reminiscent of swirling water, B, a piece of wood used as a floorboard or an eave with a tomoe pattern, or C, a family crest with a tomoe design on the kimono, for example. Now, the original pictogram glyph is meant to be indicative of a huge snake, especially one that doesn't know its limitations and tries to do something daft and impossible like swallow an elephant. Can you see the large head of the so-called snake in the pictogram? Yes? And the long body that follows? Yes, so that's where it came from. Now, Recall that Ikomikidomoe, prior to its defeat at the hands of Ichibei, getting its name erased, being sealed in a zanpakuto, etc., he thrashed and defeated a young Genryosai Yamamoto and sought to devour the Soul King. Doesn't that savor heavily of biting off more than one can chew, like a snake over-ambitiously trying to swallow an elephant? Given the writhing snake reptile connotations in the third character of the name Ichibei gave it, and it's taking on more than it ought to by, trying to defeat Yamaji, wanting to eat the Soul King, etc., Kubo depicted it as a large salamander-like hollow. Now, you may not agree that it looks like a salamander, but to me it does, so please run with it. And it still sounds like a large snake reptile thing trying to do something foolhardy and taking on more than it can handle. Just look at it. It could be a way of Ichibei trying to thumb his nose, blow raspberries at it by giving it the name Ikomikidomoe, because it certainly tells us how lowly he thinks of it and exactly what he thinks of it. You're just some lowly snake thing trying to bite off more than you can chew, trying to swallow an elephant. I mean, come on, you tried to consume the Soul King, along those lines. And of course, in the course of the plot of Can't Feel Your Own World, Ikomikidomoe tries to bite off again more than it can chew as it attempts to devour Hikone the moment the child's Reiatsu drops. So, we still get some indication that it still has, harbors some thoughts of consuming the Soul King, but it ends up getting more than it bargained for at the very end. I shan't spoil what happens, but it does get more than it bargained for. Now that we've covered the meaning of all the characters in the name, Ikomikidomoe, let's put the meanings of all the kanji and all Chinese characters together. And what do you have? A reptile that is huge, overly arrogant, but has bitten off more than it can chew. A deed that it will continuously attempt. However, it has since been cut down and reduced to a fetus that is sealed in the metaphorical womb of a sword, to the point where it can't get out unless its wielder says so. This binding is almost as tight as some kind of silken rope around the sword. And it has been cut down and reduced to such a state that anything it can't go too far. It can't attempt to be the snake or reptile that longs to swallow an elephant. I won't go into the number of strokes in the kanji or the name, as it is unimportant. That is purely for entertainment purposes and done out of academic curiosity. For now, fare thee well. Thank you so very much for listening. I shall see you when I see you. Stay safe and take care until then.